Hey everyone, it's me again, Eliza Watts. So I've been doing this whole process called the Live Journey through borderline personality disorder, and I've been getting into quite a few topics. I got into the matter of how mental health is a bit of a business. I've got into the systematic oppressions. I've got into, um, some core attachment stuff. I've got into a little bit of my background and my history of growing up in where those first forms of my BPD really started. Um, and I've gone into narcissistic traits and how I believe that borderlines are not inherently narcissistic. I think that it is a trained response and that it can be untrained. The reason why I explain this is because of the impulsivity nature of borderline, which can come off as narcissistic. Um, and I was talking about the difference and how basically your treatment through treating borderline personality disorder would be tackling those impulsivities so that you would be creating a foundation where those narcissistic tendencies would actually go down through addressing those impulsivity actions, whether that be internalized impulsivity actions or whether that be externalized impulsivity actions. I was getting into some, core attachment stuff and how I theorized that my mother laid on switching between dismissive and anxious. Anxious in the sense that, she clung to me. She this was her kid. She was overbearing. She was very very controlling, very clingy, very needy, on that sort of sense. But then on the dismissive state, she was very dismissive in getting too deep on emotional levels or developmental levels that she needed to get into with her kid. Um, and I wanted to get into personality traits a little bit more. I kind of was saying how, like it's a personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is a personality disorder. And our core attachments are essentially important to our development, but it's not actually the thing that makes a person a person. Like, and I wanted to get into a little bit more descriptions on basically the phases in my borderline and how I had different attachment styles with different counterparts or different parts of my life. And I felt like this is kind of important because I feel like through the process of my treatment and all these sorts of things, there were different layers that I started to tackle in my borderline that made me better. And um, I don't like anyone looking in and is looking for like an answer for like immediate treatment. I'm gonna look at you and I'm gonna say that that's just impossible. This is an ongoing process for people who are borderline. Um, that is because you have probably developed certain habits or certain defense mechanisms through your abuse. Um, and you're going to have to rewire each of those habits or each of those things in your abuse. And then you're going to actually have to start tackling on creating these boundaries or these definitive things about who you are and what you want in your life and what you're going to accept in your life. And I think for borderlines, boundaries is a very, very important step in treatment, because borderlines that are severe tend to have no boundaries. We are off and we're on and we're dysregulated and we're all over the place. We're really close or really away. And it's a process, essentially. The reason I say process is because, your innate responses are very, very primal. It's very, very quick. So your neurons in your brain are so used to those pathways, or so used to those defense mechanisms in order to survive, that you've learned that this is the way to go. And it will almost seem unnatural doing the rewiring process. And so the rewiring process is a lot of mindfulness, a lot of being conscious of your behaviors, of your habits, of your patterns, and getting into the psyche of what makes up you. So for personality, our core attachments are obviously important, but I feel like we make core attachments to a few layers in our lives, right? And so in my last episode, my last episode of in my journal, I kind of was getting into how in the movie Inside Out, they have these different islands. And, they have Family Island, they have Friendship Island, they have this Hockey Island, and her goofy sort of behavior. And I relate to that because I can't say that the only reason why I developed borderline was necessarily from my parents. I don't believe that I only developed borderline from my core attachments of my parents. I think that it was a huge stepping stone as to why there was breakdowns in my attachments, but it wasn't the main reason. My friendships were also a stepping stone reason as why I had developed borderline. My relation to my career and to professionals like doctors or to teachers and to jobs, those things are also part of the network of what I'm talking about. And so I think that when we go into the breakdown of all what makes up who a person is, when you go through puberty, if you don't have, these core attachments in place, puberty gets really, really difficult. And puberty includes things like gender identity, includes things like figuring out what your passions, what your hobbies are, what your interests are, the things that you like about yourself, the things that you don't like about yourself. It's kind of like this explosive time where you're just trying to figure out where you fit into in the world. And it's a thing, that every single human being goes through, is through this sort of identity, sort of formation in their lives, where they go through this testing of trial and error and figuring out what they like and what they don't like. And when you don't have core attachments, this is how, borderlines can start to develop. And this is how, in my opinion, how borderlines can really start developing. And so this is how essentially things start to break down, essentially, right? And I look back now at different phases in my life, and I see that there were phases in my life, in my borderline, where I was super self-reliant, where I was really comfortable with being myself. I was okay with casual relationships. I was okay with going on to the next thing and just trying to figure out who I am. But I was a lot more dismissive. And then there were times in my borderline where I was a lot more anxious. And I want to talk about those different phases and why I think each of them kind of happened, and also get into how each of these core attachments that we're feeling through each of these rejections, these constant rejections, rejection, we can start to really envelop this fearful rejection category that we're talking about in our attachment styles. And I think for a fearful rejection, that is pretty much the definition of a borderline. And so for me in my life, there were times that I was more anxious in my attachment styles. And there were times where I was more dismissive. And then through these different phases, or different rejections, I started encompassing more of this fearful rejection security problem. That is like a definition of a borderline, just in general. I wanted to get into treatment, but in order to get into treatment, I wanted to get into the discussion of personality and what makes up a person. And I really wanted to see if I could maybe draw up something for my next video. Just kind of talking about the building blocks of personality a little bit more, and going into the building blocks of each of these little different building blocks that I had to kind of go through to start to shape myself a bit more in my confidence and in my motivations and all this sort of stuff. And I think in human nature, it's very, very common for us to want to thrive, to want to strive, to want to get somewhere in our lives, to accomplish something, to succeed in something. And when we're not accomplishing these things or succeeding in these things, and we're receiving these rejections in life over and over and over again, you can start developing a fearful, avoidant sort of personality style. You can start to be in fear of rejection because you've had this reoccurring sort of rejection happening in your life, that these things start to develop where you're fearful of rejection itself. And so I wanted to get into this a little bit because in my first video, I was talking about the psychology of my upbringing, and I was talking about my learning disability and my sense of communication. One of the first things that us humans do, I mean, is not just like, walk, eat, sleep, the basics, but communication, talking is a huge thing. And I think for children who have learning disabilities or children who have communication problems are already starting to experience these forms of rejection in their environment, where they feel like they can't communicate what they're feeling, and easily that can escalate into further problems, like borderline personality disorder, where we get fearful of this rejection. And so I think for the first start for my senses of rejection that happened in my life was this learning disability that made me not be able to communicate my feelings, made me more emotionally upset that I couldn't, communicate my feelings. And I started to envelop these sort of emotional dysregulations just right there was through communication, being able to communicate myself. And that's a big one, because I actually through further rejections, through this a line of communication that was going on in my life, it just got worse. It didn't get better. And I don't think that I started to internalize and actually think of self-harm until about age 11. And age 11 was after many attempts and many tries of trying to communicate my anger, or trying to communicate my sadness, or trying to communicate my frustrations, or trying to have friends, or trying to make friends with people. And through that constant rejection, that I started to internalize those feelings. I started to internalize, who am I? Am I what they say I am? And I think when you're young, you're so influenced by your role models. You are so influenced by your role models, like your mom and your dad, and like your teacher, or they're like your heroes. They're like your thing that you put on a pedestal. And when that's starting to break down, and when you start to have problems with, say, like your friendships on top of these things, you can start to see how this starts to like layer on itself. So I don't think that it's just one necessary thing that causes borderline. That's why I wanted to actually get into the psychology of parental severances, of guardians, and how that can cause attachment problems, how our relations with our friendships, how our relations with ourselves. It's all a part of this thing that we call personality. So before I get into treatment a little bit more, I wanted to post this video for people to consider what makes up a personality, just in general, and actually start to consider that if you were borderline, your memory jogs are going to be really, really important on trying to source the root cause of where these patterns started. And you're going to find that there was a lot of rejection in your life that caused the very nature of you to be fearful of rejection. And so I wanted to get into that a little bit. And I feel like it's important for a lot of reasons, because the treatment was not just one treatment option. There are many ways to treat borderline personality disorder. My personal favorite was dialect behavioral therapy. Though I received just a psychotherapist for 2 of those years, and it was very, very beneficial for memory jogging, for getting to some of the root patterns and behaviors. And there was other things that I had to do within my treatment to start to tackle for my motivation, for my confidence, to feel comfortable in my skin, to feel happy, to start to build healthy friendships, to start to integrate more into family ties that I may have started to sever, Um, and, you know, I also said in my last video that, if you have a loved one that is wanting to be in a relationship with you, or if you are someone who's severe and you're wanting to constantly cling to relationship after relationship, and you have someone that's like, down for the ride or whatever, the likelihood of that person being healthy is pretty low, because people who are severe tend to have no boundaries, and so therefore they attract partners that don't have boundaries as well. Whereas healthy people generally do have boundaries, so they'll probably leave very, very quickly. But then, if you have a family member or someone that's more direct, I think it's important that, if you have a mother or a father or someone that is like around you, that wants to help you through all of this, or understand what you're going through, I think it's important that they join some form of therapy with you, whether that be couples therapy, so that or dialect behavioral therapy themselves. And the reason why I said dialect behavioral therapy themselves was to maybe get an idea of the program that you would be in, working with the physician that knows borderline personality disorder, and maybe actually give your loved one the right tool set to be able to help you, or to be able to create more secure attachments with you, by exploring this program with you. And so I say that because, many of times there are families that are overly concerned about their daughter or their father, but at the same time, they could be the very source as to what's causing the borderline problem to begin with, or one of the sources that are causing the borderline problem to begin with. And, a physician that's working with the both of you, or a physician that's working, like if you have two separate physicians, at least you'll be given a tool set, and maybe giving some ideas on how to better communicate, because ultimately this is emotional dysregulation. This is communication problems that are at its fullest. And if you're living with someone with borderline, I feel like it's important that if you're going through troubles with them and you really want to support them, to maybe consider actually receiving a form of therapy that allows you to have that emotional toolbox to communicate better with them. So these are just sort of my thought processes for today that I really wanted to get into. And I wanted to get into sort of the personality building blocks. So my next video, I'm going to actually sit down. I'm going to draw up some personality building block ideas. And under each of these personality building blocks, I'm going to talk about some treatment ideas for each of these blocks. And the reason why I say that is because even by tackling one of these blocks, you're going to get a step closer. And there are many ways of how borderline can exhibit. There's many ways of how you can have co-diagnoses even that can interfere. And oftentimes people who have borderline do have co-diagnoses. So you're going to want to figure out the co-diagnosis, and you're going to want to figure out maybe what traits that co-diagnosis even has. And like I said in my previous videos, when we talk about the physical body of things and self-care, and self-care is a huge thing when we talk about borderlines, because we often lack self-care and self-love, And self-care, can include simple things like hygiene or just eating properly. And so, when you're considering your treatment, you need to consider all these different building blocks that make up your personality and make up your health, and how they're sort of interrelated. So anyways, I am gonna cut the video for my little journal log right now. But I wanted to just get this sort of conversation flowing, maybe put your mind into thinking what those building blocks are necessarily. And for my next video, I'm gonna start drawing up my building blocks with you and talking about treatment more so. And in order for me to get into depth of treatment, I think it's important that we talk about these building blocks and what shapes personality and identity and gender identity and all of these things that are important to making a healthy individual. And I'm beyond the idea of self-sabotaging myself. I haven't thought of suicide in over 6 years now. Over 6 years, 6 to 8 years. Like, I think the 6 to 8 years even I was starting to tone down. But I haven't, actually thought of harming myself. I haven't had relations where I'm scareful of rejection the same way anymore. And I think that it's important that I talk about my rejections and what led to me being fearful of rejection, and then talking about what led to certain attachment styles and different avenues in my life where, I had relations that were very much more dismissive and other relations that were very much so more anxious and clingy. And where I was at in my head for each of those sorts of dynamics. And I think it's important that I talk about the layering effect of these building blocks and how it can create all these different attachment issues, and how we can kind of move like we're in Borderland, move in between these to accomplish a secure attachment. And all the work that you kind of got to do in order to start identifying your bad habits in order to or not bad habits, or things that you may have, not just bad habits. Yes, bad habits are one of them. But things that you were innately doing to yourself, or things that you became into routine doing to yourself that wasn't necessarily healthy, and could be a legitimate reason as to why that happened. And I try to explain through my first video of getting a little bit raw. It was heavy stuff that I was talking about, but in my first video, I wanted to get into my experiences with sexual assault. I wanted to get into my experiences of where I first felt my form of quiet BPD ever happening. And I wanted to get into some of my first experiences of rage and these emotions and where these dysregulations started, because I wanted to get into the stepping stones on how to dissect that, and then how I got to where I am now. Anyways, hope that today's considerations are for consideration. And I want to get into it because there are theories that borderlines are more anxious and more clingy in their relationship. But then I can say that there are times that I was super self-reliant, super self-independent. I didn't want anybody living with me. I didn't want anybody involved too close to me. I had casual things just coming and going and coming and going. And I realize now that, the closer I got to someone, whether that be intimate relations, such as feeling love for someone, that's where, those rejections, those core rejections, they can start to layer on themselves in order to envelop what you essentially have. Anyways, I have gone on a little bit of a rant today. I'm going to cut this short. And for my next video, I'm going to start getting into these building blocks, and getting up to the level of treatment and things to consider in those building blocks, and talk about some of the phases that I went through in my borderline. Some of the phases where I was a lot more clingy and anxious and I just couldn't let go of it. And then other phases where I was very dismissive for many of years, where I was quite content with not having a relationship or a long-term relationship. And I just want to get into each of those phases where my psychology was, and kind of get into it a little bit, so to speak. All right, guys. So consider what I'm saying about these building blocks about personality. Don't think it's just one thing. Don't think it's just, you had a bad core attachment to your mom and that's why you are who you are. I don't think it's just one thing. The reality is that there's probably many of things that caused the problem. It's like when you're trying to do something to be successful in, and you're constantly being rejected and rejected and rejected and rejected and rejected, eventually you're gonna feel the feeling of rejection naturally. Some people, I think, get rejected more often than others, and when they attempt to do things that they love in their life and they're being rejected for it, well, this is what can cause borderline personality disorder. And I do believe that environmental influence is a huge thing. I do believe that borderlines can externalize things and they can internalize things. And depending on your type of borderline, you can have major identity issues, just based off of these types of rejections that go on throughout your life, whether that be through your job, whether that be through your friends, whether that be losing the things that you love and care about over and over and over again. Maybe you had a family member that passed away, and then your close friend passed away, and then, these reoccurring instances of loss and rejection can eventually start to form the very feelings of loss and rejection. So yeah, consider what I'm saying about these building blocks. And then next video, I'll start to draw out some of these building blocks and get into the treatment for each of the building blocks. And, there's many building blocks that I will be touching on, including physical health, self-care, and including friendships, including family, including motivation, including gender identity. All of these things I really want to get into, and I hope that if you're patient with me and want to actually are curious about some of the concepts or ideas that I ponder about, feel free to keep listening. And I don't do this live journey just for you. I do this live journey because, I've personally have been through this. I have been doing 8 years of active, conscious combat on my behavior and my habits and my health, and I have read a lot of interesting texts and books and things that I know that has come to work for me. And I hope that I can give some treatment advisements or some treatment recommendations for others to consider when they're trying to tackle their borderline personality disorder. All right, guys, that's it for today. Have a good one.